Aber ich glaube, dass Gott mir Kraft gegeben hat. Und da ist die Kraft des Heiligen Geistes, wenn man Jesus Christus erhebt.
But I believe that God has given me power, and there's the power of the Holy Spirit when you lift up Jesus Christ. 0:066 seconds for over 4 decades. Pastor Franklin Graham stood before millions as the bold voice of American faith. Music, he inherited his father's name, his father's pulpit, and the kind of trust, music, that takes generations to build. 0:2020 seconds, but at 73, something inside him finally cracked. The man who once preached judgment from the world's biggest stages, music, 0:2929 seconds, is now speaking in a voice nobody expected to hear. There are stories from his early years he buried for decades. 0:3737 seconds decisions tied to money and power that quietly haunted him. And one secret he kept hidden behind every sermon. What he 0:4545 seconds is finally saying could change everything. Franklin Graham was born on July 14th, 1952 in Asheville, North Carolina, as William Franklin Graham III, the fourth of Billy and Ruth Graham's 5 children. From the very 1 o'clock minute start, his life was tied to one of the most recognized religious families in the world. His home near Montreat sat in the Appalachian Mountains, quiet and beautiful on the outside. Yet, his family name carried weight far beyond those hills. While the setting felt peaceful, the pressure around him never really was. By the time Franklin was growing up, Billy Graham had already preached to millions, and his ministry had reached well over 185 countries through broadcasts, reports, music, and crusades. Because of that, Franklin did not get to live as an ordinary boy. His school results, his behavior, and even the people he spent time, music, with were often judged through one question. What would this mean for Billy Graham's son? That kind of pressure stayed with him, and he later admitted that he deeply resented it. The family home did not feel fully private either. It often felt like a stopping place for a constant stream of music visitors from the Christian world and beyond. Pastors, missionaries, public figures, and ministry workers passed through the door as if the house were part family home and part waiting room for a global movement. One day, Billy Graham might be appearing on the cover of Time magazine, and soon after, he would be back in the mountains, welcoming guests into a living room that also served as a backstage space for a worldwide ministry. Franklin grew up watching all of it from close range. He saw how schedules were managed, how press calls were handled, and how people tried to protect his father when a long crusade had worn him down. Long before Franklin believed in the message his father preached, he already understood how large-scale ministry worked. He also saw the public side of that world. As a boy, he traveled with his father to crusades and picked up details that most people in the crowd never noticed. He paid attention to the timing of the choir, the camera work, the rhythm of the event, and the way Billy Graham would slow his voice before inviting people forward. By the late 1960s, Billy Graham had already preached in person to more than 80 million people. And Franklin had seen enough to know, music, that stadium evangelism was not simply about one sermon. It was a huge system. Crowds would move forward. Counselors would step in. Music, follow-up teams would begin their work. Decision cards and letters would arrive in huge numbers. So even as a teenager, Franklin knew how an evangelistic event was built from the inside. Yet knowing all that did not bring him any closer, music, to surrendering his own life to the faith his father proclaimed. In fact, the pressure around him pushed him in the other direction. The public imagined the Graham home as deeply holy and calm. Yet Franklin later described those years more as music, a pressure-filled life than a spiritual shelter. People expected him to be polished, obedient, and deeply religious because of whose son he was. He answered that pressure with stubborn resistance. He began smoking at a young age. At one point, his mother tried to stop the habit by making him smoke an entire pack of cigarettes at once. He got sick again and again. Yet, he kept smoking simply because he refused to give in. That was the kind of battle that marked his youth. He pushed rules because he wanted to see how far he could go. The weight of the Graham name did not draw him toward calling. It became something he wanted to fight. At the center of that home, stood Ruth Bell Graham. Music. While Billy Graham traveled across the world, Ruth was the one who carried the daily work of keeping order, setting boundaries, and shaping the moral tone of the house. Franklin later said that if he was going to follow in his father's footsteps, he first had to go through his mother's knee prints. That line said a lot. Ruth was the one who dealt with his rebellion face to face. Music. She was sharp, funny, strict, and deeply serious about faith. Music. She could edit Billy Graham's sermons if she felt his wording or theology needed work, and then turn around and discipline her children with equal force. Franklin remembered that she seemed to know exactly what he needed in each moment. Sometimes it was correction. Sometimes it was punishment. Sometimes it was simply a hug. Through his worst years, she kept praying for him and held on to the hope that he would not stay lost forever. That lost season became clear in his late teens and early 20s. By then, Franklin Graham was known in many church circles, music, less as a future preacher and more as Billy Graham's troubled son. In 1970, he enrolled at Laterno College in Longview, Texas. But the structure of college life did not suit him at all. He broke curfew, slipped off campus, ignored rules, and after only one semester, he was expelled. News of that failure traveled quickly through religious circles. For a young man already burdened by his father's reputation, it only added to the feeling that he was falling further off course. He later admitted that at that stage of life, music, a bottle of scotch, and the freedom to travel appealed to him far more than any classroom. The years that followed were unsettled. He moved music from place to place and tried school more than once, but nothing really held him. He bounced through campuses without finding direction, using the Graham name when it helped him and ignoring the expectations tied to it whenever he could. Music. Eventually, he enrolled at Montreat Anderson College near his parents' home in North Carolina. Not because he had suddenly become passionate about study, but because it was nearby and more forgiving. Even there, he did only enough to get through. People remembered him as restless, and that fits the pattern of those years. By 1974, after nearly a decade around college-level education, music finished with only a 2-year associate degree. For the son of America's most famous preacher, that modest ending felt like another sign that his life was not moving in a solid direction. Yet, the struggle inside him was never simply disbelief. Franklin later said that his problem was not atheism. It was pride. He believed the Bible was true. He had seen too much of his father's world to dismiss it. He had watched huge crowds gather. He had heard the message over and over. He knew the language of Christianity, music well. He could quote scripture. He could speak the right words when needed. Still, he did not want to hand over control of his own life. He drank, he cursed, and he ignored the pleas of his parents. That left him, music, trapped between two ways of living. One part of him wanted the freedom of rebellion. Another part knew he belonged to something much larger than himself. That tension would later shape the story he told in his autobiography, Rebel with a Cause. The turning point came in 1974 during a period of travel through Europe and the Middle East. Around that time, close to his 22nd birthday, Billy Graham sat him down in North Carolina and warned him that there was a battle for his soul and no middle ground. Those words stayed with him. Weeks later, Franklin was alone in a hotel room in Jerusalem. He had been living recklessly, and he was still carrying habits from that life, including a bottle of scotch. He planned music for another ordinary night. Yet instead of going out, he stayed in the room and opened the Gospel of John. As he read chapter 3 and came to the conversation with Nicodemus about being born again, the message stopped feeling distant. It became personal. He understood in a way he had not faced before that this was not only something his father preached to others. It was something he himself needed. In that room alone, he knelt and surrendered his life to Christ. Music, after years of resisting, he finally stopped running. That decision did not remain an isolated emotional moment. It quickly began to shape the direction of his life. Back in North Carolina, he made his change direction public in a very visible way when he married his hometown friend Jane Austen Cunningham on his parents' front lawn. To many people around him, It looked like the rebellious son had finally come home. Around the same period, Bob Pierce, the intense founder of World Vision and Samaritan's Purse, saw that Franklin was looking for something real to give himself to. In 1975, Pierce invited him on a roughly 6-week journey through some of Asia's hardest mission fields. That trip mattered deeply. Franklin saw refugee camps, leprosy colonies, war-scarred villages, and people living through immense suffering. He watched children searching through garbage for food. He met pastors who had paid a price for their faith. The distance between his former life and the pain of the world became impossible to ignore. The hotel room decision in Jerusalem now found a living purpose. Faith for him began to connect with crisis, need, relief, and action. That connection stayed with him. The experience convinced him that preaching by itself was not enough. The message had to arrive with help people could actually touch. Food mattered, medicine mattered, shelter mattered. In the years ahead, that belief would shape the way he led ministry. When Bob Pierce died of leukemia on September 6, 1978, Samaritan's Purse was still a small and struggling organization. It did not yet have the scale people later came to associate with it. Franklin was still young, only in his mid-20s. Music and his earlier years of rebellion had not been forgotten. Clear's throat. He had been publicly ordained only a short time earlier. Even so, in 1979, he became president of Samaritan's Purse. That decision placed a young and still controversial preacher in charge of an international relief organization at a moment when refugee crises and global instability were growing. Over time, that small ministry changed dramatically under Music, his leadership. Samaritan's Purse expanded from a limited operation into a major global organization working in more than 100 countries, with some reports pushing the reach closer to 170. By the middle of the 2010s, its annual revenue had climbed into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Rapid response teams began showing up in places hit by earthquakes, tsunamis, disease outbreaks, and war. The organization became known for moving quickly into moments of disaster. Whether in Haiti, parts of Asia, West Africa, or the Middle East, projects multiplied, teams traveled, chaplains deployed, mission work and emergency relief became tightly linked. Within a few decades, Samaritan's Purse moved from being a niche ministry into one of the most visible Christian relief organizations in the world. One of the most recognizable parts of that expansion came through Operation Christmas Child, launched in the early 1990s. The idea was simple enough for anyone to understand. A person packed a shoebox with toys, hygiene items, and Christian materials. Then that box was sent to a child in need. Yet the scale became enormous. Music, by 2016 alone, nearly 11.5 million children in 104 countries were reported to have received boxes through the project. Ministry estimates also claimed that more than 1.5 million of those children made decisions for Christ. That made the Shoebox campaign more than seasonal. Music charity. It became a global pipeline that joined aid and evangelism in one act. And that combination drew both praise, music, and criticism. At the same time, Franklin himself became a subject of growing attention and debate, especially over money. Public filings showed that his combined music compensation from Samaritan's Purse and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association reached very high levels in some years. Some reports, Music placed the figure around $880,000. One Charlotte Observer investigation put a single year as high as $1.2 million. Records from 2013 listed $25,919 in salary and $34,502 in additional compensation from the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, along with $449,927 in salary and $181,325 in additional compensation from Samaritan's Purse. Those numbers placed him well above many top charity leaders in the United States, and Music raised direct questions about whether a man preaching sacrifice should be paid at that level. The issue followed him and remained a point of criticism inside and outside Christian circles. His religious authority also became more formal as his public work expanded. In 1982, he was ordained at Grace Community Church in Tempe, Arizona. That moment held special meaning because it came after so much instability in his earlier life. The young man who had once been expelled from college, known for drinking heavily and living recklessly, was now being publicly recognized as music minister. By then, he was already leading Samaritan's Purse. Music. So, the ordination did not launch his ministry as much as confirm the road he was now on. During the 1980s and 1990s, Franklin began building his own evangelistic ministry more clearly. His events were often called festivals rather than crusades, and they started in venues smaller than the stadium settings most people associated with Billy Graham. Even so, the crowds and responses showed that Franklin was finding his own audience. During an 8-day Australian crusade in 1996, he drew 114,000 attendees. Over a 3-day stretch, 1,527 out of 25,000 people responded to his altar call, a response rate of 6.1%, which reportedly exceeded Billy Graham's earlier results in Australia. Reporters noted that more than 80% of those who came forward were under the age of 25. That mattered because it showed Franklin was not only standing in his father's shadow, he was connecting with a younger generation in a different way. A major moment in that shift came in 1995 in Toronto. Billy Graham, already older and weakened, became too frail to continue a crusade and asked Franklin to take the pulpit in his place. That was more than a practical decision. It felt like a visible transfer of trust in front of a huge audience. Franklin had long resisted the idea that he would become his father's heir. Yet at that moment, he stepped into the role in a way that the public could clearly see. After that, ministries inside the Billy Graham organization increasingly began shifting media, travel, and logistical music attention toward Franklin Graham festivals. These no longer looked like side efforts. They started to look like the future of the ministry after Billy Graham's final official crusade in New York in 2005. By 2000, Franklin had become CEO of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. And in 2001, he formally took the title Music of President and CEO while still leading Samaritan's Purse. With that, 2 major Christian organizations, one centered on mass evangelism and the other on humanitarian relief, came under the leadership of one Graham Ayre. And in 2001, he formally took the title Music of President and CEO while still leading Samaritan's Purse. With that, 2 major Christian organizations, one centered on mass evangelism and the other on humanitarian relief, came under the leadership of one Graham Ayre. Under his watch, Samaritan's Purse continued to expand globally, and Operation Christmas Child eventually passed 200 million gift-filled shoeboxes by 2023. At the same time, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association pushed Franklin's preaching across television, radio, and music digital platforms. His voice became harder to separate from the Graham name itself. As a preacher, Franklin Graham built a global platform of his own. He has preached in all 50 American states and in more than 50 countries. In 2008, a 4-night music festival in Taipei drew 183,328 people. That same year, meetings in Belfast brought in 32,783 people over 3 days, and an event in Charleston, South Carolina, drew 34,997. Those numbers confirmed that he could still gather large crowds in the years after Billy Graham's peak. Yet, the content of music, Franklin's preaching often felt sharper and more confrontational than his father's later style. He spoke more bluntly about sin, repentance, Islam, same-sex marriage, and American politics. Supporters saw boldness. Critics saw aggression. Either way, his public voice had become unmistakable. That sharper tone showed most clearly in controversy. On November 16, 2001, only 2 months after the 9/11 attacks, Franklin Graham appeared on NBC's Nightly News and called Islam a very evil and wicked religion. On September 5, 2002, he repeated similar claims on Hannity and Combs, arguing that Islam preached violence. Muslim leaders and interfaith groups strongly condemned his words, warning that this kind of language could deepen hatred and make a painful moment even more dangerous. He continued drawing a hard theological line in later years. In December 2015, he publicly supported action against Wheaton College professor Larisha Hawkins after she said that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. Music, Franklin pushed back forcefully, saying they did not. His criticism was not limited to Islam. He also made comments mocking Hindu beliefs and images, treating them as proof that other faiths were spiritually false. He regularly linked these views to a wider culture war message. In the United States, music, he turned LGBTQ rights into a frequent target of his public statements. He condemned music, same-sex marriage, abortion, and transgender rights as signs of national rebellion against God. In 2019, during Pride Month, music, he attacked the idea on social media and compared it to celebrating serious moral wrongs. Civil rights groups and major watchdog organizations pointed to these music remarks as part of a broader pattern of harmful rhetoric. A clear example of his influence came in January 2015 during the controversy at Duke University. The school had approved a plan to broadcast the Muslim call to prayer for about 3 minutes each Friday from the chapel bell tower, starting January 16th. On January 14th, Franklin Graham attacked the decision on Facebook, calling it a slap at the Christian faith and urging donors to stop supporting Duke. Within about a day, the university reversed course, citing credible and serious security threats, and moved the prayer call to a smaller setup near the chapel steps instead. Franklin publicly praised the reversal, calling it the right decision. The episode showed how quickly his words could shape public pressure in highly charged religious debates. For years, Franklin Graham has spoken as if America is standing at the edge of disaster. Over the last decade, he has used his platform to warn Christians that the country is slipping into moral collapse and that only a return to biblical authority can pull it back. In 2016, he wrote that the United States was getting dangerously close to a moral tipping point. He said, music, hostility toward Christianity had spread through government, media, courts, and education. And he described the moment as open season on Christians. He tied that warning to the Supreme Court's 2015 same-sex marriage ruling and to what he believed was growing government control over charity, healthcare, and public culture. From there, he launched the Decision America Tour, traveling to all 50 state music capitals and urging Christians to step back into politics because, in his view, the nation could only be healed by God. That message soon grew even sharper. Graham began speaking about elections in spiritual terms, turning campaigns and voting into part of a larger battle between good and evil. In his sermons, magazine articles, and public events, he argued that America's crisis came from the failure of the church. He said believers had allowed the state to take over the work of feeding people, clothing them, and caring for them. And he urged Christians to repent and reclaim the nation. Over time, this language gave political conflict a much heavier meaning. Abortion, LGBTQ rights, and the direction of the country were no longer presented as ordinary policy fights. In Graham's telling, they became frontline struggles in a war over truth, morality, and obedience to God. By the 2016 election, Graham's political role was impossible to ignore. Some conservative commentators even credited him with helping Donald Trump reach evangelical voters. Music, after Trump entered the White House, Graham often defended him with striking force. During scandals and public backlash, he suggested Trump's critics were almost demonic in their hatred. He also argued that God has often used flawed men to carry out larger purposes. Music, through that lens, Trump's presidency was treated less like a standard Republican administration and more like a rescue mission for the country. Graham's own circle pushed that message further, warning readers about the Equality Act, attacking what they called music godless Democrats, and presenting Trump as a defender of religious freedom. Even after Trump left office, Graham kept speaking about him as a rare barrier against secularism and socialism, strengthening his image as a political champion for conservative evangelicals. His language about the left followed the same line. In interviews and magazine pieces, Graham warned about what he called anti-God socialism, especially among younger Americans. He complained that many churches had begun to support homosexuality and said progressive music, politics were encouraging people to turn away from God and his standards. In his framing, abortion, LGBTQ, music rights, and gender debates all belong to one larger movement pushing Christianity out of public life. That way of speaking brought theology and partisanship together so tightly that opposition to the political left started to sound like a spiritual duty. Then came one of the strangest public controversies of recent years. In April 2026, Trump posted an AI-generated image that looked very much like a traditional picture of Jesus, showing him in white robes with a red sash. The backlash came fast and from both sides. Trump later claimed he thought it looked like a doctor helping someone, deleted it, and then shared another image showing Jesus with a hand on his shoulder alongside music, a caption aimed at the radical left. On April 15th and 16th, Graham stepped in to defend him. He said he did not believe Trump would knowingly portray music himself as Jesus Christ and dismissed the uproar as a lot to do about nothing. That response drew criticism even from some conservatives. Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, said it was one of the worst things she had seen and argued that Graham should be leading Trump to Christ music instead of excusing him.